Thank you for those that have come in. We are so grateful to have you all here tonight. We are continuing our study this week on the 12 apostles, often called 12 ordinary men. The Bible, the New Testament, refers to them simply as the 12 over and over. And we are moving on as we do these character studies this week. We've studied Peter and Andrew. Tonight we are looking to finish up that first group of four. If you'll notice in the listings through the Gospels, the apostles commonly are listed in groups of four. And this first group of four is considered to be the closest, the inner circle. We've talked about a few times how these are the ones, at least three of them, Peter, James, and John, are commonly invited to those special things. The transfiguration, the raising of Jairus' daughter, the praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we will mention that again tonight as we talk about James and John, as the Bible, or as Jesus called them, the sons of thunder, Boanerges. You know, I made the joke when Mandy was expecting Jude that I kind of hoped it was a boy so that I could have Boanerges, because then I would call them sons of thunder, which would make me thunder. Nobody really picked up on that, so we didn't let it roll, but if you want to call me thunder, I will be okay with that. As we mentioned in the study of Peter, Jesus had a tendency to use a name, an affectionate name, like Peter, because that was not his name. His name was Simon. But he referred to him as Peter because he said he was a rock. And he would use those names interchangeably. Similarly, and we don't know how frequently he used the name Boanerges for these two, but in our study tonight you will see maybe some small degree as to why he referred to them as the sons of thunder. It speaks to potentially their character, it speaks to their heart, it speaks to their motivation and their boldness, as they were indeed the sons of thunder. This is indeed James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They are almost always mentioned together. James and John, the sons of Zebedee. For that matter, James is not mentioned outside of his brother anywhere in the Gospels. It's always James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Sometimes they're simply referred to as the sons of Zebedee. So maybe Zebedee was a big guy. For that matter, we'll talk about that in a second too. He may have been kind of a big deal, which is funny because I wore my socks today that say I'm kind of a big deal, and it's got a pickle on them. So you can see a picture if you'd like later. They're always mentioned as a pair. They are both characters of great zeal for the Lord, and we will back that up with scriptural reference here in a minute. So some quick facts about the Sons of Thunder, other than having the most awesome nickname that a pair of people could ever have. They were fishermen in the city of Capernaum, which is on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, just like Peter and Andrew. They were partners with Peter and Andrew. They worked together with Peter and Andrew. We see that in several instances throughout the early New Testament. So these four already knew each other before coming into the fold of Jesus Christ, before being called. And for that matter, as we studied with our study of Andrew, come and see, as Andrew would say, when Andrew was first called, he got his brother first, which is still just the most awesome thing that I can remember in my recent studies. How amazing, what a great heart. He's found this wonderful thing. I mean, if you found that pearl of great price in a field, are you going to stop and get someone close to you first, or are you going to go get that pearl? My tendency is to go get that pearl. But Andrew stopped, and he went and he got Peter. Okay, sidebar, sorry. So they were partners with these guys who, obviously from our studies, we know that Peter and Andrew had some knowledge of what to look for. When Andrew says, we found the Messiah, that was not a small thing to say. And James and John had a similar understanding because they, just like Peter and Andrew, quickly picked up and followed Jesus when he showed up there on the side of the Sea of Galilee. Because Zebedee's name is mentioned over and over and over, then culture tells us probably he was a prominent figure. Maybe he was a very wealthy businessman. Maybe his fishing business was quite large. They mentioned having workers with them. So they were wealthy enough to hire other people to work with them. And it is always that he is mentioned as Zebedee over and over and over. The only time we hear Simon Peter's dad's name is when Jesus addresses him, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of John. That's all we know about Peter's dad. So Peter and Andrew may not have come from the same type of prominent family, but they perhaps were fortunate to work with someone who had a little more financial backing. As I mentioned, they are commonly, almost always, mentioned together in the Gospels as a distinct pair. And the reason I've paired them up in this class is because we don't have a lot of information on James. I didn't want to try to spend a whole class period on one verse that James has mentioned by himself. So You're welcome, maybe? I don't know. We'll see. There is theory here, and there's no direct proof of it, but theory that Zebedee may have been of the tribe of Levi. It may have been that James and John and Zebedee were indeed Levites. You may remember, and we'll get to this toward the end of our study tonight, that John had access to the courtyard of the high priest. When Jesus was taken there for his kangaroo trial, John had access. Somehow their families had connection with the high priest, and some have theorized that perhaps Zebedee was indeed a Levite, a temple worker. And then when he wasn't assigned in the temple, he was out on the sea fishing. So those are some facts, some theories, and some information that we have about the sons of thunder. All right, James. Let's spend a moment and talk about James. Simple observations. As I've mentioned, of course, their dad, Zebedee, is mentioned over and over. But the other simple detail to look at here is that James and John are always mentioned in that order. James and John, probably signifying birth order. James potentially was the older brother here. James and John shared many of these same personal qualities, but because they're always mentioned together, at least in my mind, I always kind of assign them to James. But they're likely both because they're always lumped in together. He is never mentioned in the Gospel separate from his brother. And as I mentioned, there's only one verse in the New Testament where he is mentioned separately, and that's in the book of Acts. That is in Acts chapter 12. And the sad part of this is the only time he's mentioned separately is when he was martyred for the cause of Christ. And we will come to that at the conclusion of our James story, which will be a very short portion of our study today. The gospel story is mostly the story of both brothers. And so we're going to spend a little time talking about a couple of stories that include them both. They are present, of course, at those three major events of the inner circle: the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration. The more I read about the transfiguration, the more I can't even imagine what they must have experienced. Peter, of course, with his foot-shaped mouth, had to open his mouth and say, hey, Jesus, while God's speaking, basically, should we build some temples here, some tabernacles to celebrate this wonderful occasion? And then God's booming voice comes in and says, this is my beloved son. Because Peter, of course, can't keep his mouth shut. But what an amazing thing to see. And then Jesus says to them, just like he did with Jairus' daughter, don't tell anybody about this until my kingdom comes. Don't tell anybody about this. But they saw him glorified in some, I'm going to say, spiritual form. We don't really know, but his clothing gleamed whiter than any detergent could have gotten it. And Elijah and Moses appeared, and apparently they would know who these people are by their appearance, even though there were no cameras at the time. Maybe it was the way they were speaking. Maybe Jesus identified them. We don't know. But James and John were there. James and John were also there, not only at these moments of great glory and great celebration, but they were there when the sweat drops of blood poured from our Savior's forehead, when he was in his worst turmoil, when he was about to be betrayed, and when he was going to be led off to be crucified. They were there in the Garden of Gethsemane. They were there when Jesus said, wait here, I'm going to go over there and pray. And just like Peter, they fell asleep because, wow, it was late, people. It was late. But they were there. They were there. Obviously, these two men were eyewitnesses of the great power of Jesus. To watch a 12-year-old girl, guesstimate, a 12-year-old girl who is obviously dead, and Jesus says, she's not dead, she sleeps. And he tells her to get up and give her something to eat. That story hits me in the heart every time. And they were standing there, and they saw it happen. And it obviously affected them. So, there were witnesses of his great power. There were witnesses of his heavenly glory. And there were witnesses of the human suffering that he took on. He took on not only because he didn't have a bed to lay on, he didn't have a house to live in, but they were there and they traveled with him and they lived with him and they experienced some of it with him. Obviously not the worst part. We'll come to that shortly. So let's talk about a couple of stories about James and John. Number one, fire from heaven. Have you ever been so mad at somebody that you wanted them just to burst into flames? I mean, okay, maybe that happens. It's a good thing that we don't have the power of God behind us to do that, because that's exactly what James and John asked for, and they both asked for it. This is found in Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56. So the story is that the disciples were traveling with Jesus on their way to Jerusalem, and there were two major paths to get to Jerusalem. One went all the way around the geography to get to Jerusalem so they would stay in Jewish country, and the other was a direct road right through the middle of Samaria. And they hated these people, and these people hated them. The Samaritans, commonly thought of as sort of half-breeds. They were part Jew, part whatever you might call it, or as most of us Americans are, kind of mutts. We're a little blend of everything. And the Jews hated them. One, it started with you don't worship God the right way. And the old law said that if you don't worship God the right way, you should be killed if you're a Jew. And so there was this disdain and this anger that lived there. And then because it just became this ongoing thing where you're telling us that we're wrong to worship this way, and so we're going to say we can worship this way, and they just kind of went at each other all the time. It got so far they wouldn't even travel through each other's cities. But Jesus was in a hurry. And in Luke chapter 9, we also know that Jesus was not a respecter of persons. And for that matter, he was not a hater of persons. So he didn't carry that same animosity. So Luke chapter 9, verse 51, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, that is Jesus, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans, which to our Jewish apostles was probably a shocking thing. Why are we going here, Jesus? But it's Jesus, we're following him, to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. Oh, you think you're so holy, you're going to Jerusalem? No, thank you. You have no part in our city. When his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, you've been declined. They will not accept your money here. Do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? That seems aggressive, right? But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. You know, Jesus' part in that story seems very small, but he was teaching them a lesson. So why in the world would James and John ask for fire to come down from heaven? Now, jokingly enough, I thought to myself as I was reading through this, where was the fire coming from? Were they going to produce it? Who were they going to ask for the fire from? It would be coming from God, right? They're asking God, hey, do you want us to ask you to send fire on these people? That's almost like one of your kids coming. No, not even your kid. That's like one of your neighbors coming over and saying, hey, can I have your credit card? I'd like to donate $5,000 to St. Jude's.
Do you think they might have been just kind of like patronizing or something, saying, yeah, I know you're a big deal, and internally them saying, this is never going to happen, I know, but
Yeah.
he might like the fact that we're going to say in so many words, like you said, your card got declined, but we know you're awesome.
You know, that's an interesting take on it. If you didn't hear that in the back, maybe they were schmoozing up to Jesus saying, I know that they don't think you're a big deal, but we know you're a big deal. We know that you could send fire on them. Of course, they do very distinctly say, and that is included in the original language, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? Which is kind of funny. Who had given them miraculous powers prior to this? Jesus. But Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? I think that's humorous. Now, this is not just some probably spur-of-the-moment thought about fire from heaven. There are stories about fire from heaven. You may remember a couple of them. They both relate back to Elijah. Elijah tended to call down fire from heaven. Now, there are really two occasions, but they're not small occasions. And so James and John potentially are telling us that they know Jewish history. They know the prophets. They know the old law. They know the writings because this was something that spiritual beings had done before. If you look specifically at 2 Kings 1, 3 through 10, this is where Elijah has given the message to King Ahaziah after he'd fallen through the lattice work that he was not going to recover from his illness. For that matter, Ahaziah had not even sent messengers to him. He had sent messengers to some other medium. And Elijah stopped him and said, oh, by the way, you can go back and tell Ahaziah that he's not going to get up from that bed. And they went back, and immediately Ahaziah knew who had stopped them because of the authority with which he spoke. So Ahaziah says, I'm going to send 50 soldiers, and I'm going to go get Elijah. You 50, go get him. And they went and got him. Elijah, come out. And Elijah called down fire from heaven and burned up the 50 soldiers. He actually then turned around and did it a second time to another group of 50 soldiers. And Ahaziah, who I'm starting to think is not super smart, sent a third group of 50 soldiers. But this captain had a little more sense. And he comes up sheepishly and he says, oh, please, Elijah, don't send the fire down on me. Please, we're just messengers. Please don't send the fire down on me. And God tells Elijah, go with them. Elijah called down the fire to take the people out because he knew their mission was not a mission of God. It was a mission of an evil king who did not serve God. So this is not an uncommon principle in Jewish history. Secondly, a more glorious picture of fire coming down from heaven, also Elijah, 1 Kings 18, 30 through 40. This is the famous story of the prophets of Baal. We're on Mount Carmel, and Israel, by King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, has been thrown into idol worship. And they have these 450 prophets, and Elijah finally challenges them, hey, we're going to build 2 altars. You pray for fire, and I'll pray for fire. And whichever altar is burned up, that is the true God. Well, who did the fire come from? God, not Baal. Elijah called the fire down from God. God consumed the altar, consumed the sacrifice, consumed the water, and then they went on a killing spree, and they killed all 450 of those prophets and anyone who aligned with them. So this does indeed show some zeal for the honor of Christ. Maybe it speaks to their zealous pursuit of who he is and his importance and his power. And you know what? If you don't see it, we're going to burn you up with his fire. So indeed there is that zeal. There's some motivation to honor our Christ, to honor the Messiah, because he was a big deal. And these people weren't acknowledging that. They had that knowledge of Jewish history and the prophets, but also they were not yet understanding Jesus' purpose. Gentiles had not been welcomed into the fold yet. Certainly Samaritans. I bet the Jews would have been happier to have Gentiles than Samaritans at this point. But they had not been welcomed into the fold. All right, quickly, another story of James and John. The request of thrones. How many of us have been asked to sit on a throne? How many have requested to someone else that they allow us to sit on a throne? That's kind of weird, Nolan. Anyway, but the story of James and John, and one gospel account includes their mother, the other does not include their mother. Ultimately, the idea is that potentially this was their own thing and they just asked their mother to do it. So in Matthew chapter 20, we read, the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up, this is verse 20 of Matthew 20, came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something, and he said to her, what do you want? She said, say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom. Well, that's bold. Jesus answered, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? They said to him, we are able. That's a pretty quick answer. He said to them, you will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. When the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. You know, funny enough, all 12 of them had discussions about who was the greatest. But this kind of was the icing on the cake. It's like you went to the principal and said, hey, can I be the one that doles out the discipline? And they were not happy about it. The same story is recorded in Mark chapter 10, verse 35 through 40. It does not reference their mother. Later, her name is given to us as Salome. She is named among the women who are traveling with Jesus. Likely she was involved in the preparation of meals. She likely provided financial support, as we know that the women in their group, for some reason, tended to be a lot of their financial support, and supported their traveling while traveling along with them. So Salome was part of this group as well. And they were like, hey, Mom, you're kind of a big deal because you're kind of supporting us and you're making sure that we all have food. Will you ask Jesus if we can sit on his right and left hand? Still shows their boldness, that they are excited about the kingdom. They want to be a big part of it, but it also shows some selfishness. It shows a lack of understanding. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I don't think any of us would have understood, based on the decades and millennia of Jewish history, what Jesus was about to do, because that had so been lost in Jewish tradition. Selfish pride continued to be a struggle at this point, but they listened to correction. Yeah, they took some heat from their, if you want to call them, classmates. They took some heat because it was stupid. They took some heat for it, but they clearly took Jesus' message to heart. And why do I know that? Because Jesus said, will you drink the cup? And maybe without fully understanding, they said yes. And it wasn't but just a few years later, in Acts chapter 12, when we learn that James, the older brother of John, the son of Zebedee, was the first of the apostles to die as a martyr for the cause of Christ. Will you drink the cup? Absolutely you will. And when James said, I will, I am able, he proved that he wasn't kidding. He proved that he was going to do it. I don't know at what point he decided he was really able to do it, but he did it. He was beheaded probably. The Acts chapter 12 verse 1 says that Herod laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church, is what Acts chapter 12, verse 1 says. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. That likely means beheading. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. We also know this is the story where Peter was then miraculously rescued from prison. He was the first apostle. It was ironic that shortly after this, give me a seat of honor, the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that James indeed was the first one to die for the cause of Christ. I shouldn't say the first one, the first apostle to die for the cause of Christ. Stephen was killed in Acts chapter 7 and 8. Church history records, and this is from Clement of Alexandria, that the man who led James to the judgment seat in front of King Herod potentially was a closet Christian himself. But he's leading James to this judgment seat. And he was so moved by James's commitment that he uncloseted himself. I too am a follower of Christ. And they were beheaded together. That one passage that we learn about James tells us that his devotion was so motivating that someone who had been ashamed to say something about it potentially put his own life at risk obviously did put his own life at risk, just by admitting who he was too. Perhaps it made that man finally put his foot down and say, I said I'm committed, but now I'm committed. And it doesn't matter what your background is, if you can influence that one soul to truly give themselves to Christ, then that is what we can learn from James's martyrdom here today. Now, we all know that some of those stories of church history have been clouded over the years, so who knows if that particular story, but it comes from a very ancient source, Clement of Alexandria, one of the oldest church fathers that we know of. And so there is some suggestion that some of that indeed was true. All right, so James and John are always together. We're going to leave James behind because we have a lot more information on John. Why do you say? Well, there are a few books named after him. John is one of them. First John is another one, and then you may decide that Second John and Third John go along with that, and Revelation. Behind Paul and Luke, John is the third most prolific writer in our New Testament. So we get a lot more insight into John. John winds up being a fairly simple man as far as the way that he explains things. And I don't mean that as a negative, but he had some very specific patterns the way he wrote. His gospel kind of stands on its own. It does not necessarily jive the same timeline and stuff that what we call the synoptic gospels do, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They follow a very similar timeline. They share similar stories. And while John includes some of those, John includes his own narratives. That is what you would call prose. He's writing a story. So he's literally just narrating. But when you get into his epistles, which would be more of his opinion, and granted, this is all inspired scripture, so it's not just John inserting himself, but you hear the style of John, and you hear who he really was. John was a man who always wrote about truth. Truth. How many times do you read the word truth? I believe it was somewhere around 80 that he says truth in his writings. John commonly is known as the apostle of love. Despite those very similar qualities of James, who was bold, he was zealous, maybe a little over the top for Christ early on, calling down fire. But clearly this apostle of love comes from his later writings. He fulfilled the role of an early church father. He's the only one that survived through the first century. He's the only one that was not martyred for the cause of Christ. He outlived all the others. He encourages the churches of Asia, and many kind of think of him as this elder statesman of the church because he was there from the beginning. I'm reminded of a line from the musical Wicked, where the wizard is singing and he says, a man is called a traitor or liberator. A rich man is a thief or philanthropist. Is one a crusader or ruthless invader? It's all in which label is able to persist. Well, which label of John's persists? The apostle of love. Because he wrote such powerful passages that we sing in our greatest command song, love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Those are words that come to mind. John says in his Gospel, chapter 8, verse 32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. He's this man of grand understanding. So a few things you'll notice in his writings. I encourage you to go back and read the epistles especially, because this is John writing to people personally. You're going to hear his personality through inspiration. You'll hear truth, 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 truth. You'll hear love, love, love. And you'll hear witness, witness, testimony. Give your story. Tell people your love for Christ. And these themes recur over and over and over in those short epistles that John wrote, and they can be very moving and they can be very, very motivating for us as Christians today to continue to seek truth, to continue to seek love, but more than anything, to tell people what Jesus has done for us. One last style you'll see about John is that he always tends to speak, and I just did it, in stark contrast. It's black or white. He talks about life and death. He talks about light and dark. He talks about truth and lie. John's writings are very simple in their message. He gives no room for exceptions, although you can read it and see that he knows that it's there, but he's trying just to give the basic concepts. He contrasts very much to Paul, who some people have referred to as the author of exceptions. See Romans chapter 7 and 8. But he gives these strong contrasts. His push for truth could lead him to be an extremist. It could lead him to be even exclusionary in certain times. The one passage in the Gospels that John has mentioned by himself is when he's kind of tattletelling. He goes to Jesus in Mark chapter 9 and he says, hey, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us. And just like when they asked to be seated on thrones, Jesus said, do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able to soon afterward speak evil of me. For the one who's not against us is for us. That's Mark 9, 38 through 48. Through his writings, especially those epistles, we see that John indeed learned what Jesus was trying to teach him. Balance. Truth and love. You can go real crazy if you're all about truth. Well, truth says this and truth says that. And you can go real crazy if you're all about love. Just love everybody and just love them. Just love them so much. You can't just love them. But he learned the balance. And it's such that same battle that we fight today. John is such a great example of this. He continued to stress the importance of truth, but balanced it with love. As I said, Jesus rebuked him, and John learned it. Let's read in 2 John, verses 1 through 6. This to me is a great summary of where John found himself as he was reaching the end of his life. The elder, John's referring to himself, to the elect lady and her children. Some think he's referring to the church itself. Some think he's referring to his actual physical woman, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. Truth and love. If you love, you will walk in truth. If you're interested in truth, you will find love. The greatest commandment that God ever gave us. Look at the difference in this zealous, brash young fisherman who wanted to call down fire on those that offended the Lord, still standing firm for the truth, but now with a deeper understanding of Jesus' purpose. Maybe he was influenced in John chapter 13 when they were gathered around the table and Jesus himself, the Lord, the Son of God, the being by whom all things were created, stood up and wrapped a towel around his waist and washed their feet. That's power under control. That's truth and love. It is John that gives us that famous passage, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. That's 1 John 4, verse 7. John brought his zeal, his devotion to truth, and his heart to Christ. Every week I think this character is my favorite. Last time I thought Andrew was my favorite. The time before that I thought Peter was my favorite. This time I thought James was my favorite. I think John may be I don't know. But what did that do? What did that mean for John? I'll tell you what it meant for John. He reclined at the table on the Lord's chest. That's closeness. He was close to Jesus. John followed the betrayed Jesus to the court of the high priest. That was concern. That was trying to bear the burden. John is the only apostle recorded as an eyewitness to the crucifixion. He was standing at the foot of the cross. That's bearing one another's burdens. He couldn't take him off the cross, but he was there. This John took Mary, the mother of Jesus, into his own home. That is common love. That is Acts chapter 2. We are all together. and we're making sure that everybody's needs are met. This John outran Peter to the tomb. Oh, they're going to know. He outran Peter to the tomb on that glorious Sunday morning. That is joy. That is joy in Christ. This John endured, and this is one I've never thought of before until studying this. He endured learning of the death of every one of the apostles, including his own brother. He had to hear the news. He didn't get to just lose his head and suddenly it was over and he's in paradise. He wasted away, eventually on the island of Patmos. Tradition tells us he died in AD 98. He had to be in his 80s at least, and we're talking first century. I mean, people didn't live that long then. AD 98, and he had learned of the death of every single one of those apostles. Every last one of them. That's perseverance. At what point do you not just go, well, that's it. I give up. I'm done. This is John that we remember as the apostle of love. He never stopped waiting for the return of the Lord. He penned these words in his very last book, the Revelation. This is Revelation 22 and verse 20. He who testifies to these things, speaking of the Lord himself, surely I'm coming soon. And what did John say? Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. He was ready. He was ready, but he was willing to wait. That's perseverance, that's love, and that is being founded in truth. And I'm so inspired by John. The author of the book entitled 12 Ordinary Men, his name is John MacArthur. He is a denominational preacher, but he has studied this subject in detail, and I find some of his thoughts to be very helpful in summarizing here. He summarizes this group of first four apostles. Thus the fishermen of Galilee, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, became fishers of men on a tremendous scale, gathering souls into the church. In a sense, they are still casting their nets into the sea of the world by their testimony in the Gospels and their epistles. They are still bringing multitudes of people to Christ. Although they were common men, theirs was an uncommon calling. These men demonstrate the power of common men letting themselves be the instruments of Christ. So let yourself be an instrument. Maybe you'll be the church member of love. Maybe you'll be the church member with a foot-shaped mouth. Maybe you'll be the church member that just says, come and see. But be a member. And don't give up. Singing next week, because it's the last Wednesday of the month. And then I believe we're moving on to